the end. Okay, just a brief introduction about IT Connection. We've been in the business of providing IT services for 18 years, providing support to various clients in different industries using various technology platforms. We have many NFP clients in different industries using various technology platforms. We have many NFP clients as a result of referrals and endorsements. We partner up with many reputable vendors. Sophos is definitely one of them. Thank you. And receive direct training from them to ensure that we provide our clients with the required expertise to support the systems. Sophos is our partner in this talk as well, which will present the second half of the webinar. Okay, so current cyber climate in Australia, it's not looking good, to be honest. Cyber crimes just keep going up and up. It's happening more often, approximately 13% increase from previous financial year, which is increased as well in severity. Nearly half of the incidents categorized as substantial, meaning most likely this stops your staff productivity and or business continuity. For example, your website's down, email not working, you can't access files to process client requests while your IT team's trying to restore the infrastructure for example, last 2 days, so it's not good. We see in the graph in the next slide, interesting to see that spike in the cyber attack at the top here somewhat correlates with the when Australia starts to have its first wave of confirmed COVID cases, both peaking in April 2020. So the graph at the bottom is from Wikipedia. It goes to show that major events happening in the world is often used as entry point for phishing attacks. As I mentioned before, cyber attacks are happening more often with increased severity, resulting in financial loss of a total of around 33 billion for Australian businesses, averaging $9,000 for small businesses and 33,000 for medium and 20,000 for large organizations. For damages resulting from business email compromise in particular, either from phishing attack or password spraying, the average reported loss is increased about 55% from previous year. Financial 2019 to 2020 is about 33,000. Currently, it's about 50,000. This is where the attacker takes control of your email account and requests fake money transfer using altered invoice and sending it to your partners, or the attacker takes control of your contractor's email account and again sends fake invoice to your business to be paid. Few varieties, but all in the same vein where the attacker has compromised a business email account. As we see from the data provided by the ACSU, Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the pandemic has been used as a weak point to gain access to organizations' infrastructure by means of social engineering, phishing email, phone SMS. There's these type of phone scams also on the rise. So they're taking advantage of the current global events. The pandemic is probably the worst thing that I've seen in my lifetime. The devastating effect on families, especially elderly, no doubt its impact to our society, and attackers will exploit and take advantage of anything to get what they want. The next slide is quite typical as we see the frequency of cybercrime landscape in various states in Australia. Sort of makes sense based on the population numbers, number of businesses as well. New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland is the top 3 respectively in terms of population numbers as well. WA and SA next. Interestingly, WA and SA has the highest average financial loss. So even though it happens less often, but it has more impact. So the next part is the interesting one. So this is the aggregated results of our phishing training over the period of 2 months across various businesses. We see the highest impact in our baseline phishing email, which is unannounced phishing email in the form of simple Google Calendar invite from a company executive or management teams, which usually their names are available on your website. An invite for a performance review to staff. This is quite a high number. Three to four people on average for every 10 staff in the company will fall for the phishing attack. In terms of percentage, you might think 35% is not that bad. Plus, it's just phishing. You can't be that bad, really. But if we use the analogy of Russian roulette, it's now totally different because the impact can be quite devastating to your business. You're playing Russian roulette where it's like 35% chance of losing $10,000 if you're a small business, 30,000 if you're a medium business, as we've seen from the statistics by ACSC before, and around 20 if you're a large organization. Not to mention your reputational loss if you have to declare breach to the government as part of your due diligence. Now, for some businesses, getting caught by social engineering scams can be life or death to the business, as one case was covered in the news. An Australian hedge fund fell for business email compromise and sent $8 million to hackers. They mostly recovered the funds, but the investors then pretty much go bye-bye. No more business for them. Loss of trust in the company, definitely nothing to scoff at. The next one is categorized per industry sector. We see trades association, legal services, and community services has the highest rate of failure based for the baseline phishing attack, which is again the Google Calendar invite from management for performance review. So these percentages are calculated per industry sector, meaning for community services, for example, out of 515 people, 199 fell for the phishing attack, giving us 38%. People in the community service group fell for the phishing attack. Interestingly, half of the participants were using their mobile devices, like phone, tablets, to check their emails, SMS, which makes sense because we're more mobile and dynamic and we rely more on our mobile phones as a secondary work devices. I don't really see a lot of antivirus product for mobile devices, so that's another unprotected area to look at. So we know on average cybercrime is increasing in Australia in terms of rate of occurrence and impact. Most businesses has high percentage of staff failing for phishing attack. I mean, you as an individual most likely won't fall for a phishing attack, but we need to think as a whole company, you need to account for everyone in your organization. Talking about your cyber due diligence as a business owner or leader, you're responsible for protecting your customers' personal information. It's the law. Last year, the Australian government released Australia's cybersecurity strategy, highlighting the action by government to protect Australian businesses. The project fund is one of them. Action by communities to practice secure online behavior. Action by businesses to secure their product and services, and protect client data and personal information. If you do experience data breach, you'll need to report it to the OAIC, or Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. You might be asking, what constitutes a data breach? Well, that's if full name and mobile number, that's considered a personal information. Basically, if you need to comply with the Privacy Act. If you have a annual turnover of over $3 million a year, must comply with the Privacy Act. If your turnover is less than 3 million, you still have to comply. If you are a private sector health service provider, including childcare centers, mental health support, either in person or via the phone, contractors providing services under a contract with the Australian government, or businesses that trade in personal information. Some recruiting agencies are not included because they receive consent from all the relevant parties. How you can be compliant with the Privacy Act of 1988. I think the slides backwards, sorry. How you can comply with the Australian Principles of Privacy Act in 1988, by adhering the privacy protection framework called the Australian Privacy Principles. There are 13 sections in the APP addressing, for example, APP 3, a proper way to collect personal information. What constitutes a personal information? mobile number, full name, that sort of stuff, that's personal information. So if you store those, you need to be aware of how you collect them. The APP Section 3 describes the proper way to collect personal information. APP 6, the use or disclosure of personal information. Some of these principles will require your organization to adapt your internal policy. Some will require technical approach, such as APP 11, the security of information, which basically say we need to take reasonable steps in implementing strategies related to ICT security, access security, and data breaches, for example. What reasonable steps are we talking about? Well, this is where Essential 8 comes into play. A quick poll here. Are you familiar with Essential 8?
I am now going to launch the poll. If everyone could just pick one of the options. Are you familiar with Essential 8? Yes, we are fully compliant to maturity level 3. Yes, we have plans to adopt Essential 8, or not at all.
It's basically a mitigation strategies that's been provided by the ACSC.
Okay, we'll wait for a few seconds. I think people are still answering. There's 21 answers that came in already. We'll wait for a few more. I will share the result after this as well. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the result. Right, hand it back to Oscar. Thank you.
Okay, that's interesting to see. Some of you fully compliant, which is great. You have plans. 22% have plans, and most, about 3/4, not really familiar with Essential 8. So this is definitely that you should take into account for future planning of the cybersecurity of your organization. Thank you, everyone. That was interesting to see. Again, Essential 8, basically, it's simply 8 mitigation strategies provided by the ACSC. It has many commonalities from widely recognized standards, international standards like ISO 27001, the NIST, or VPDSF, if you're dealing with government-related parties, might be familiar with this, or Victorian Protective Data Security Framework, basically specific to Victoria. Essential 8, basically, what the ACSC has provided to make it more simple and easy in terms of implementation for SMEs to do this. Okay, for the next half of the presentation, I'll hand over to Brian, where we will talk a little bit more in detail on how we defend and implement Essential 8. Over to you, Brian.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Oscar. That's really interesting with the polling for the familiarity of the Essential 8, especially for people who are sort of getting themselves to fully compliant to maturity level 3. So today I'm going to be aligning the Essential 8 mitigations to threats, so you can have a bit of a better understanding of how they protect you. I'll also go into the Essential 8 maturity model. And then lastly, I'm going to use a real world use case and align how the Essential 8 can potentially assist against an attack from that side. So moving to the next slide. So I want you to stay with me here. It's important to know a little bit how a malicious attack works, so at least you leave today a little bit more vigilant. We have many attack groups currently, such names such as Black Matter, DarkSide, Atom Silo, Avendon. Generally speaking, the attack process is fairly similar. Infiltration is generally started with a spam or phishing email. This could be to simply get credentials to be used separately, or it could be linked to a malicious website that gives the attacker control to the device. Once on, they will then do a call to home, and this then allows the attacker to choose their next step. Depending on where the attackers land, they will generally intend to spread, as they don't want to just simply stay on one system. They want to have as much control as possible. And so the attack cycle continues, spreading and control, spreading control, so they gain as much access and control. And this leads to the attacker deciding on their next attack. Most attackers will generally prepare to do what's known as ransomware or encrypt your environment, but others will also exfiltrate or steal data. So going to the next slide, and I want you to also get a basic introduction to what the common cyber threat goes through in a life cycle. So depending on the scenario, the recon and weaponization on the left, you can simply treat this as what we know as attack planning. How you as an organization has been picked is generally out of your control, but adversaries are no longer simply spraying malware, using spam, and then working out who you are afterwards. They generally have you in sight. Common scenarios for recon and weaponizations can be a business profile. Particular industries are being picked on by adversaries. Identifiable job titles, simply reading news, social media, someone comes up that is easy to follow. Say someone comes up in LinkedIn with a director or financial controller title that is linked to something else that of particular interest to the adversary. If the user profile can be tracked, then that can create a thread to target the organization. New starters in particular are identified as they're easily posting their new job titles. If an attacker can combine a high-profile employee and a new starter joining that department, they potentially have a spear phishing scenario almost fully mapped out. Outside of user targets, device targets can be also identified. With recent critical vulnerabilities for external-facing devices such as Microsoft Exchange or Citrix Netscaler, these are simply being picked up by network scans and then stored in repositories such as Snowden. Moving on to the delivery phase, this is where the attack is delivered, be it at the first stage of a spear phishing, where a particular user is targeted and somewhat engineered to open a document or click on a link, or as I said about the external facing systems, those are simply directly attacked. With the delivery comes what is known as exploitation. From a user targeted attack, this could be exploiting the web browser or the Office application, but what is happening is what is known as in the temporary space. Nothing has actually been written to disk, but the adversary has a foot in the door to the device. Beyond the exploitation, moving on to installation, occurs to get a permanent foothold. By having something written to disk, this can be re-executed, and permanently this leads to having what is known as command and control. Now, the key thing to remember is that an adversary may have done this on the first computer, but this is most likely an endpoint, and there may not be that much they can gain from this endpoint. They could potentially install Trojans if the target is handling banking information, or they could get other credential information that's on the device. If the adversary is very lucky, they may actually get credentials that is valuable on the network from an endpoint, but generally this is what I like to call the fog of war. That is that you have been dropped into enemy territory, but you actually have no idea what is around you. So the next step for an adversary is to explore and repeat the attack process. If the device is within the network perimeter, the attack is completely different. As they now have full command and control, they could directly attack a server where there is no firewall protection between the endpoint and the server. The vulnerabilities they can attack are more common and easier to expose. RDP, SMB, internal vulnerabilities on an intranet server, etc. And this attack cycle begins again and again. During this time, movement and adversarial activity may not be using exploits or malicious code. If they've been able to scrape credentials and can log on directly to devices, they can simply laterally move around using normal system tools. Exfiltrating of data using known and trusted archiving tools. And then finally, we get to the actions and objectives. That adversaries have determined what matters to you system-wise and know and has identified how the organization operates so they can find a window where they can kick things off that is out of hours and potentially has the longest durations. Long weekends or summer breaks are hot times for attacks, but weekends, if they can clearly see the organizations operate Monday to Friday. They use their tools, but also quite commonly your tools to deploy malicious code to the desired computers. Part of that process is to delete backups, and if possible, disable security software, and then obviously to encrypt the environment. So this in essence is the threat cycle. So moving to the next slide, we're going to look at how the Essential 8 is trying to do to prevent this from happening. Notice how I've removed the pre-attack stages of recon weaponization from the cycle just for clarity. We can treat application hardening as a method to prevent the delivery of malicious content. Disabling Java, ensuring legacy frameworks such as .NET 3.5 or PowerShell 2.0 are not installed simply reduces your attack surface and stops early malicious activity happening in the first place. Patching of the operating system and applications is based around stopping an exploit from being exploited. We have a phase here at Sophos: patch early, patch often, patch everything. And this aligns to stopping a breach happening via a vulnerability that is already known to the community. Application control resides in the installation phase. I spoke about adversaries using malicious payloads to get full command and control. I also spoke of adversaries using trusted applications to explore and loudly move around in the network. By all means, system admins may need to use system tools to scan a network or archive files, but actual users do not. This is where application control comes into. To A, stop the trusted application from running in the first place, and B, alert people that this has been detected. Macro settings also reside in the installation, as macros are generally being used to spawn new processes and download payloads. Simple attack documents would exploit an application like Word or Adobe, but sophisticated attacks would download a payload via macros using PowerShell. As this is being written to disk, I treat this as an installation. So multi-factor authentication, or MFA, and we can kick off an MFA poll while this is happening, sits in the command and control phase, as this is controlling access to your systems. If passwords have been compromised for public-facing systems, then having MFA acts as your last line of defense. If there's one takeaway from today's session, ask yourself what systems you have externally configured and if they have MFA enabled. If any systems, be it email, VPN, external facing intranet sites, hopefully not RDP, that doesn't have MFA enabled, then that should be your first task. I like to call the business email compromise, or BEC, the non-malicious malicious playbook. Restricting admin privileges also aligns to command and control. The intention of admin access is to restrict where this access can be granted as much as possible. A common poor scenario is the IT team using their normal accounts to access privileged systems. The intent is to limit access to these privileged systems, thinking of conditional access if you're looking at a cloud service, so they are only used in specific areas by specific users. This ensures those credentials don't become the first entry point for an adversary and lets them jump straight into command and control. Then lastly, backups is the preventative measure to deal with an incident. It's the yang to the adversary yin when attempting to ransomware your environment. While you don't want to be resorting it due to an attack, you don't want to find out that you lack the required backups because of an attack. So going to the next slide and having a look at the polls and what we can see, what have we got there so far? And we've got, awesome, so we've got most people using some form of MFA. And maybe we've got some people that are in the process of planning to. So it's good to see that we've got quite a lot of people already got MFA front and sides. And to be honest, we've got everyone MFAs front and center in their sites. And we've got quite a number of organizations in their mindset saying, yes, the whole organization has got, MFA as an implementation process. I still would also keep it in mind to verify that mindset to make sure there is no backdoors from a system side of things. But it's great to see we've got a high level on that side. So moving on to the next slide. So if we simply thought the Essential 8 is simply to tick those eight features like the MFA, patching, app control, etc. It is not. The Essential 8, which was formerly listed in 2017, but there has been evolutions on what is known as the maturity levels. So if you read the maturity levels, this is what is stated. Maturity level 1, partially aligned with intent of mitigation strategy. Maturity level 2, mostly aligned with intent of mitigation strategy. Maturity level 3, fully aligned with intent of mitigation strategy. Level 0, which was recently reintroduced this year, is stated as the maturity level signifies there are weaknesses in an organization's overall cybersecurity posture. While the words weakness, partly, mostly, and fully align makes you simply say that you have to aim for level 3, there is a potentially high cost to implement and maintain at that level. This generally means that we should look at level 3 as being aimed strictly for large organizations. Level 1 is aimed for small organizations, and level 2 aimed for mid-sized organizations. Saying that though, you as an organization need to review the levels and identify what is the cost-benefit ratio to you. If, for instance, you have no need for macros in your documents within your organization, you can implement a zero macro policy and be at level 3 as you simply disallow and enforce this as an organizational policy. However, you may also be crippled by an internal intranet system that can only run on a legacy Internet Explorer browser. So you need to create a long-term plan to replace the system before you can go beyond level 0 for user application hardening. So to summarize, the maturity level needs to be regularly reviewed and aligned to the business size and goals. So going to the next slide, I'd like to use a recent example of Avendon, which certainly did attempt to attack locally, especially in the local government sector, so much so that the ACSC did release alerts and IOCs to look out for. Now I want to go through the attack sequence that our Sophos Labs and our rapid response team saw was the common process with Avendon. This mostly aligns to what I spoke about earlier, but with a few twists. Infiltration was a variety of ways. There were phishing emails to get people to go to malicious websites, but that was particularly prevalent was external facing devices, such as vulnerable servers like Microsoft Exchange or VPN gateways that were unpatched and unprotected by their firewalls. RDP was also a common tactic. Once they were on, they were immediately attempting to get valuable credentials. The way they did this did vary, but one common scenario was that they were on the server was to do what is known as credential harvest. This was a method to read the memory of the device to get cached credentials. If they could not see any valuable credentials, and good systems should not have admin accounts in memory, then what would they actually do is attempt to purposely break the system so an admin would log on to troubleshoot and then bang, they would get some cached credentials. Now that they have the credentials, the recon phase would begin. They would use normal system admin tools and laterally move around the network if they were allowed to. Remember, they now have admin credentials to map out what they have. They would be seeking data, backup, and management systems. If possible, they would also seek security systems. While they're exploring, they'll also be selectively dropping backdoors. While they have a way in, they want to ensure that they don't lose this. They commonly use the backdoor that was being used by pen testers, but other malicious backdoors were used. We treat backdoors as installations. Also, when they've found the treasure chest of data, they will immediately start to exfiltrate. Again, this would use normal off-the-shelf tools such as WinRAR or rclone. They commonly would upload to a site known as mega.nz, but they would use other file uploading sites, including Dropbox, Google Drive, and even OneDrive. Getting ready to attack, they will be looking closely for backups and how to disable or delete them. If possible, they will use the network admin tools to get this ready, and this will be seen as a form of a scheduled task. And now the fun or the attack actually begins. If possible, they will disable any security systems So if management of the security system is on-prem, watch out. Cloud-based systems were potentially vulnerable if credentials are known and there was no MFA. We have seen attackers simply turn off policies because the adversaries had the credentials. They would then use system tools to deploy malicious code. This could be via scheduled tasks, group policies, or even via the management tools like SCCM or Manage Engine. This script again used a number of layers, including known potentially unwanted applications, to stop services and then deploy and run the ransomware tool. Also, timing of the attack is critical, as encrypting is a time-consuming exercise. They'll attempt to find a window for extensive coverage. Weekends are common and long weekends were more desirable. And now, while they're in a position of power, they would stay online and monitor what is happening internally while they wait for the communications. If they see restorations occurring, especially if they were unable to delete the remote backups, they would attempt to sabotage the restoration exercise. And it was not over. As I said, they've transferred files, so they would use this as leverage for the ransomware, slowly releasing files or selling to the highest bidder if the data is really valuable. So moving on to a poll. I'll just give people a few moments to answer that.
This is just a poll. Do you have any access monitoring in your organization? There's 3 options. You can just choose one. Yes, our cloud or on-prem access are always audited and have controls with the alerting for anomalies. No, but we're planning to, or no, have no plans in the near future. We're just going to wait for a few seconds for everyone to answer. All of the answers are coming in as well. Just think, yeah. All right, I'm going to end the poll and show the result.
Yeah, awesome.
Right.
So yeah, awesome. Yeah, so it looks like we've got a number of people looking at doing it or planning to on this side. I mean, if you sort of look at some of the key takeaways from today, and especially from that use case that I used with the Avendon, there's a lot of processes in place that would identify as a potential alarm bell. So having some monitoring to come in and alert that something that is not right is quite critical to sort of identify of what we call an indicator of an attack. So moving on to the next slide, let's review how the Essential 8 through Sophos endpoint or InceptX can stop the threat. If we remember phase 1, infiltration, this aligned to exploitation of the systems. So everything in the exploit phase is to stop this. From an Essential 8 perspective, it was all about patching. From a Sophos InceptX perspective, this is about exploit mitigation, which is built into the product and designed to protect against exploit attacks. I'd also note outside of the endpoint, the firewall is quite critical for external facing systems. While we provide exploit protection, which can be used to mitigate the vulnerability, I'd be focusing on the firewall with this intrusion prevention engine, having the necessary detections enabled. It's been far too common that we see IPS or intrusion prevention on the firewall turned off on the public facing systems. Phase 2 was about getting credentials. Now from an Essential 8, this aligned to the command and control phase. MFA is a part of this, but this really aligns to users accessing external systems. In this scenario, restricting admin privileges and importantly, our credential theft protection, which protects directly against a tactic used to scrape credentials. Phase 3 was all about exploring and setting up the backdoors. So I align this to the installation phase. From an Essential 8 perspective, this is what it's about application control to ensure applications are not installed. From a Sophos perspective, I align this to the installation phase or installation protections of machine learning, potentially unwanted applications or PUA protection, and malicious behavior. Malicious traffic detection also assists. We have exfiltration, which again, if we look at the Essential 8, only application control can assist with this. I would add the DLP protection and the network protection in InceptX as you would be seeing unusual traffic. And then in the attack phase or the actions and objectives, the Essential 8 is purely reliant on backups. This is where InceptX is stepping in and providing a whole list of protections. This includes PUA protection, machine learning, process protection, and lastly, CryptoGuard as what I like to call the last line of defense. A lot of protection layers and importantly, alarm bells for you to be alerted to something is happening. So going to the next slide and to wrap up today's discussions. I hope you have an understanding of how the Essential 8 aligns to protecting you against threats. Do also understand when looking at the Essential 8, it is not simply a one product solution. It is a combination of processes, procedures, and of course products. It is also something that needs to be reviewed and verified, not just at audit time, but regularly. If we take patching, for example, you would need a patch management system, of course, but you'd also need to have a process to identify the vulnerabilities, notifications, and you'd also need a process to validate that you are no longer vulnerable, patching or querying the devices directly. This also needs to work with how your environment operates and to a time frame. Lastly, align the maturity level to what suits your organization. The higher the maturity level, generally the more costs will be involved to the business. So you need to calculate what is acceptable to you as an organization. And that wraps up my my discussion for the Essential 8 on that side. So over to you, Rihanna or Oscar.
Brian, that's pretty much it. We're in the Q&A session now. If anyone has a question, thanks everyone for your time. I'll wait just 1 or 2 minutes. Does anyone has any questions? Okay, doesn't seem like there's any questions. That's good. Maybe I'll add something. So I think implementing Essential 8 may sound sort of daunting, but if there's absolutely one takeaway from this is you should implement MFA in full, addressing any implementation gaps, such as disabling legacy authentication and ensuring that MFA applies to everyone in your organization, even contractors that access your organization's resources. I'm talking about your scan to email printer account, your staff opening up email via default Apple iOS mail account, that sort of stuff. So also to remind that everyone, IT Connection offers initial consultation for getting everyone up to speed with Essential 8. So please do contact us if you're planning to be more compliant to Essential 8. I think that should wrap up the webinar. Thank you everyone for your time and attendance. Thank you, Brian, for the great presentation as well. That's definitely a good thing to learn. Yep, that should wrap up the presentation now.
Thank you, everyone, for coming joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian and Oscar. Bye.